Welcome back to another explainer. Today we are absolutely decoding the modern corporate landscape. So, if you've been feeling, totally overwhelmed by the sheer volume of corporate sustainability announcements lately, trust me, you are not alone. I really wanted to find a way to separate the actual environmental champions from the, let's say, brilliant PR strategists. And digging into the data revealed this absolutely fascinating mental model. This framework cuts right through all that noise. And honestly, exploring these findings completely changed how I look at corporate promises.
Okay, let's dive into this. Section 1. The question nobody asks.
So, we live in an era where practically every major company out there has some sort of shiny green-tinted sustainability announcement, right? You've undoubtedly seen this exact type of headline 100 times. We pledge to cut emissions by 30% by 2030. I mean, it sounds amazing, doesn't it? It's bold, it's forward-looking, it's neatly packaged. When a company proudly declares a goal like that, we're totally conditioned to applaud, to buy their products, and to feel like, hey, we've done our part by supporting them. But it creates this massive illusion, hidden right in plain sight. Companies leverage this psychological response because, well, our human brains just love clean, optimistic numbers. But without looking deeper, we're really just accepting a comforting story rather than measuring any real progress. But when you actually look at the data, a highly critical question emerges, and it's one that almost nobody asks when these press releases drop. Is that goal actually enough? Boom! It completely shatters that comfortable corporate illusion. Because honestly, a percentage in isolation means absolutely nothing. Think about it like this. If I tell you I'm going to eat 30% fewer calories, but I'm currently eating 10,000 calories a day, yeah, I'm still vastly over the limit. We absolutely have to know what the required baseline actually is. Without understanding the fundamental threshold for success, any ambitious-sounding percentage is literally just a number floating in a vacuum. It might be an improvement, sure, but it doesn't tell us if the core problem is actually being solved.
Which brings us to Section 2, the science-based standard.
And this brilliantly illustrates that to find that true baseline, we have got to look way past the flashy ESG reports. The source material points us to a rigorous, completely objective yardstick, science-based targets, or SBTi. Now, this isn't just another bit of corporate jargon I stumbled upon. It's a global framework that explicitly dictates exactly how much companies need to reduce their emissions. It acts as an uncompromising scientific boundary, not just a gentle suggestion box. It's fascinating to see how this model completely shifts the power dynamic. Instead of corporations dictating the terms of their own environmental scorecards, SBTi brings in peer-reviewed science to set the absolute minimum viable threshold for actual, meaningful action. And the entire framework hinges on one very specific number, 1.5 degrees Celsius. Keeping global warming below this incredibly urgent threshold is the ultimate goal that grounds all the complex math behind the scenes. It basically takes the physical limits of our planet's atmosphere and translates them directly into measurable corporate responsibility. What really struck me in the research here is that 1.5 degrees is not some arbitrary target. It's the critical tipping point identified by climatologists. Past this threshold, the impacts of climate change become exponentially more severe and, frankly, unpredictable. So the SBTi framework uses this absolute physical limit as the rock-solid anchor for every single emission reduction calculation it makes. Which brings us to a stark contrast in how goals are actually set. For years, the standard has simply been whatever is convenient for a company's operations, or whatever looks good in an annual shareholder report. But the SBTi framework flips that entirely. The new standard is strictly about what is mathematically required by climate science. The friction between convenience and scientific reality is where things get really, really interesting. When a company sets a goal based on what feels achievable within their current quarterly earnings plan, they are working backwards from a business constraint. But when they use science-based targets, they have to work backwards from a planetary constraint. And that is a fundamentally different and often much harder way to do business.
All right, let's move into Section 3, commitment versus performance.
Let's see how this builds, because this is where we really develop a vocabulary to act as your own personal BS detector. Imagine a massive gap between two realities. A company might set a goal of a 10% emissions reduction and proudly call itself sustainable. But what if climate science dictates that, to stay within that 1.5-degree limit, that specific company actually needs to reduce emissions by 50%? Visualizing this discrepancy completely changes everything. You suddenly see this vast chasm between a comfortable corporate gesture and the cold, hard math of what is actually necessary to mitigate a global crisis. It just highlights how easily a company can technically be reducing emissions while simultaneously failing to do their required part. When that gap exists, the reality becomes glaringly obvious.
If science requires a 50% cut and a corporation pledges only 10%, that 10% goal is not a sustainability commitment. Let me say that again. By falling so drastically short of the strict scientific requirement, the very concept of a commitment is completely invalidated. They aren't committing to fixing the problem, they're committing to doing the bare minimum while maximizing positive PR. A true commitment implies doing what is absolutely necessary to achieve the required outcome, regardless of the difficulty. A partial effort, no matter how beautifully it's packaged in a press release, fundamentally fails that test.
Instead of a commitment, it becomes what the research calls a sustainability performance. And there it is. That is the exact difference between meaningful climate action and mere public relations. It's a theatrical show. It's designed to look like progress, to generate positive headlines, without actually doing what the planet mathematically requires. This concept of performance versus commitment is arguably the most powerful takeaway from the data. It shifts our role from being these passive consumers just accepting corporate narratives to active analysts, evaluating the actual substance behind the show. We stop applauding the act, and we start demanding the reality. Now, what's really interesting about this data is the sheer scale of the issue. We are looking at more than 7,000 major companies globally making public claims about their environmental impact. Thousands upon thousands of corporations, all vying for consumer trust and investment dollars based on their green credentials. The pure volume of these announcements is exactly what makes the noise so overwhelming. Literally every industry, from fast fashion to heavy manufacturing, is suddenly touting their sustainability. Navigating this landscape without a rigorous mental model like the SBTi framework, it would be nearly impossible. It's a massive global stage filled with actors, and finding the ones actually doing the real work requires some serious vigilance. Which leaves us with a final provocative thought. Out of those 7,000 plus companies shouting about their green initiatives, which ones are genuinely committed to the science, and which ones are just performing for the audience? The next time you see a flashy green ad or a bold emissions pledge, remember this framework. Look for the science, look for the 1.5 degrees, and ask yourself, are they committing or are they just acting? Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer, and keep asking the hard questions.